Welcome to Type Tune Tint. I'm Tom Kranz. Today's guest has literally held the gift of life in his hands. Dr. David Weill has saved countless lives during a storied career as a transplant surgeon at the Stanford University Medical Center Heart-Lung Transplant Program. He kept a journal, took some writing courses, and now has a new novel, All That Really Matters, drawn from actual experiences told through the eyes of a fictional alter ego. The title refers to that nagging question his protagonist and maybe the rest of us wonder about at one time or another. What really matters in our lives? And I'm joined by Dr. David Weill from his, one of his two home bases. Today he's in the Florida Panhandle, but you also share time in New Orleans, I understand, correct?
I do.
Another hot spot. I'm here in New Jersey where the high temperature today is supposed to hit 90 degrees. Again, it's either hot or raining in New Jersey. So, that has nothing to do with anything except I'm trying to generate a little bit of pity and sympathy here. David, you have your resume is so vast and so interesting that it really kind of goes beyond the term resume. You've lived an amazing life. For years you were a transplant surgeon, transplanting mostly lungs, but hearts as well, I guess, right? And you were the chief of the transplant projects at Stanford University Medical Center. Now you're a consultant. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing now.
So I'm more coach than quarterback these days for transplant programs. I go in and help programs that are struggling for a variety of reasons, team dynamics, clinical outcomes, administrative, financial, and I have clients both here in the US and internationally.
So you spend a lot of time at hospitals, I'm guessing.
I do. I do.
And do you like stand there in the OR while they're doing their surgery, or do you do like on screen kind of tabletop stuff, or how do you do that?
Not so much standing in the operating room. I look at a lot of data, and unfortunately, I have a team that works with me that helps me. But we look at a lot of data, a lot of outcomes. I meet with the physicians a lot. Coach them in a lot of different ways. And so I'm not so much standing by their side as I am meeting with them and also looking at some of the data that's produced from the program.
So I'm old enough to remember when, transplants were like a novelty, everything from, a lung to a heart, the first heart transplant, and then, pieces of livers and kidneys and all that. Assess for me right now in 2024, kind of the state of the whole transplant, the whole transplant thing. Like, where are we? Are we, are you amazed yourself at how far things have come, and where are we going?
Yeah, I think actually, especially in the last few years, there's been an amazing progress. I mean, I would call the progress steady since I got involved in the early 1990s. But I think since then, the progress hasn't really been steady. The last few years, I think it's been explosive.
Mm.
All sorts of reasons for that. Xenotransplantation, taking animal organs and putting it into humans is really starting to come more clearly into focus. And we also have better ways to keep organs alive outside of the body so that we can transplant them at a more reasonable hour and more
Mhm.
safely. I think these are huge strides forward.
Yeah, it is really amazing. I mean, I haven't had a transplant, but I've been a recipient of a couple of hip replacements, and I just had my second hip replacement 10 years ago. I had the first one, and in those 10 years, that procedure alone has gotten so much different. I mean, now, 10 years ago, it was like 3 nights in a hospital and then 12 days in inpatient therapy. Now, the 3 hours after they cut me open and put this metal hip in, I was walking and I was doing steps, and I went home the next day. And it's been just a total. I guess I'm just really amazed and thankful that medical science, that all these breakthroughs have happened here. Why did you decide? So in your youth, you decided I'm going to be a doctor, but you didn't just want to be a doctor. You wanted to be a transplant surgeon. That seemed like what you wanted to do from the get-go. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of things in life, it was serendipity. I showed up for my internship fresh out of medical school just a couple of weeks after my graduation, and a more senior resident, somebody 5 years out from medical school, which is much more senior than I was, got sick and was unable to staff the kidney transplant service at our hospital. And so they asked one of the interns to volunteer to do some of the more menial tasks. And I raised my hand and I was hired right on the
Don't you
spot.
know you should never volunteer for anything?
I
That'll
know.
teach you.
Yep. And so the first night that I was on the service, we did a kidney transplant. I didn't obviously have anything to do with it at that stage, except I was assigned to sit by the guy's bedside all night and wait till he peed. And I sat there and I wrote about this in my first book. I sat there and waited for the urine bag to fill up, and I couldn't believe it. It started, it started happening, and I was hooked from the get-go. And I happened to also be at the right place at the right time when I was training in pulmonary medicine, which is, lung medicine
Mhm.
in Denver when they started a lung transplant program. And so I got in on the ground floor. It was really just being at the right place at the right time.
Wow, I can't even imagine what the exhilaration must be. I mean, you captured a little bit of it in your novel, where your protagonist, Dr. Joe Bosco, who is, I'm guessing, is a little bit of a kind of an alter ego of you, but we'll get into that in a second. You wrote a nonfiction memoir first, and I'm going to I did not read that one just in full transparency. It's called Exhale: Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. And this was basically a series of stories, a memoir of, some of the highs and lows of your career. Is that an accurate assessment?
That's very accurate.
And you did that why?
When I left the front lines of transplant medicine, I had a lot on my mind. A lot had happened, especially toward the end of my 20-year run in it. And I had been keeping a journal for many, many years, and I wanted these patient stories to come to life. But I also wanted to talk about the team dynamics and, working on a team like this can sometimes be magical when you all pull in the same direction, and sometimes not so magical when you don't.
Yeah.
And I wanted to peel back the curtain and show the readers what is it like to deliver this kind of care every day.
Did you keep that journal with the intention of writing a book at some point, or not?
Not really. I kept it really just because I wanted to remember the patients really that we transplanted because I heard from some of the older physicians that, they just blur together after a certain amount of time. And then I started taking some writing courses at night at Stanford, and I decided, look, I think I have a story here, and I'm going to start piecing it together, and that's how my memoir came about.
Well, your novel it's a great story. I'll admit that when I started reading it, I wasn't a big fan of your main character. So, the main character in David's book, which by the way is called All That Really Matters, a novel by David Weill. It's actually going on sale in mid June or so of 2024, and I got an advanced copy of it. And I was determined that, first of all, your story is what attracted me because, as I said before we started rolling, I wrote a novel also kind of based on real life. But I got to say that your protagonist, Dr. Joe Bosco, who's your main character, he's a transplant surgeon and talks about how he got into it. And I wasn't a big fan. He was, I guess, because he came from this background of kind of white privilege. His dad was this kind of almost godlike figure, and then I slowly got sucked in when I started reading kind of the details of med school and how you kind of were balancing dealing with your character was balancing reality with kind of dreams. And I think that's something a lot of people can identify with. If I can ask you just to get it out of the way, how much of you is in this character? Is it really based on you, or is it just more a broad caricature?
It's really more of a broad caricature. I mean, there's certainly similarities. I'm a transplant doctor, and so was he. I spent some time in New Orleans, so did he. I like to ride my bike, so did
Stanford and Stanford.
yeah. But after that, really, there really aren't any similarities. He did some things and got himself into some situations that I certainly never got into, thankfully, during the course of my career. So I think the similarities pretty much stop there. But what I can say is that all the characters in the book, including Dr. Bosco, were based on people that I really did see in real life. And
Okay.
so these characters were very much people that I worked with. They were either individuals or combinations of individuals that I worked with. And the situations that they found themselves in we're very much real world. This is not science fiction. These are real world situations that have been fictionalized.
So and the cases that you talk about here, the transplant cases, are they based on real cases also?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
they really are. I mean, there's all kinds of situations that happen, within our field, and some, I couldn't really talk about, and certainly couldn't talk about in the same kind of depth I talked about it in my novel
Sure, I totally get that. Yeah.
when I wrote my memoir, and I think you understand why.
Yeah.
And I also couldn't explore some of the broader themes in healthcare that I wanted to talk about, and what's wrong with our system, what are some of the ethical and moral issues, and I feel like writing the novel gave me more latitude to do that.
Yeah, so when I started writing what turned out to be my novel, I first approached it as a memoir because, after 22 years of answering 911 calls, 8 of those years working a fairly high pressure job in New York and then commuting from, 3 hours a day. That was like 3 hours a day that I never got back.
Right.
I realized that there were some stories worth telling and some stories, as you say, that I didn't want to lose. By the time I got 50 pages in, I started realizing, this might hit a little bit close to home for some people. I live in a small town. There are some people who might recognize these people. I don't know. And I don't want to come anywhere near violating somebody's privacy. So I kind of stopped and I went back and I started to make it a novel, with all made up characters. The 911 calls are based on calls I went on, but they've been so doctored, if you will, and changed that I doubt anybody could ever actually see that, oh yeah, that was me. But I also found that it gave me a lot more freedom. When you're making stuff up, it's a lot easier just to tell a story. Did you find that as well when you were writing a novel versus a memoir?
Very, very much so. I mean, I wanted to make sure when I wrote the memoir that I was accurately portraying, what happened, and I also had to do quite a bit of work to make sure that I wasn't offending anybody or any place. And that those same constraints really weren't on me when it came to the novel. I wrote my main character, as you pointed out, he was a little rough, especially at the beginning of the book. But I do think he transformed, as time went on, and it's very difficult to write real life characters like that in nonfiction. Whereas I think Dr. Bosco, my protagonist in the novel, unfortunately, he's very much like a lot of people I've worked with.
Well, and I think that's what drew me in. I mean, I don't know how much, your Dr. Bosco had substance issues, he was, and you created, as I created this really disaster for my EMT protagonist that he had to, he ended up basically at the bottom of, he was in exile from his career because of this massive screw up. Your Dr. Bosco makes a massive screw up in the operating room. I don't want to, no spoilers here, folks, but let's just say it was bad.
Yep.
And then that was complicated by alcohol use and kind of his own ego. Did that? So I'll just come at it. Was substance abuse a part of your growing up as well and part of your professional life, or was that something that you made up for the book?
Yeah, I made that up for a book. Fortunately, I have not had that issue, but I will say that there are folks in the hospital, and this is true of every high pressure job I think that's out there, that had substance issues, dysfunctional behaviors, of other kinds. They either drank too much, had anger management
Sure.
issues, infidelity, all sorts of things happen in a hospital ecosystem. And I drew upon all of those experiences for the novel, but I personally didn't have trouble with any of those.
I'm glad to hear that. But I got to say, for somebody who never actually had that going on, you really nailed it. Your character, he goes through all these changes. A lot of what he does, he's trying desperately kind of to live up to his father's expectations. And then he goes through a period of time where he loses the love of his life, Kate, and then he gets her back. And that, again, I don't want to do a spoiler, but that was really a very touching part of the story, and that was very real to me as well. Um, what was your process for writing? Did you sit down every night and just, you know, cloistered yourself in a dark room and tapped away, or did you kind of write as did you something come to you while you were driving and you then dictated into your phone, or how did you physically write this book? That's always interesting to me.
I kind of split my day in half. I still do. I'm working on a third book right now, and I split my day in half where the first half of the day before lunch is my writing period, and I do that quietly by myself. And then the second half of the day is my consulting work that I, often either meeting with folks or talking on Zoom with people. And my day is really split that way. I don't really outline my books. I kind of write and see where they go.
Me too.
You know, I had certainly broad a broad understanding of what I wanted to do with this character. But I mean, you mentioned the love interest that he had. I think one of the things that I learned about doing this kind of work, and maybe you saw this in your career as well, is, in order to show somebody what happens to people that do this kind of work, you have to show the impact that it has around them.
Mm,
And I wanted to show that loud and clear, that the people around Dr. Bosco were being impacted by the way he was. And it was important for me also to show a female physician his love interest, and that her aspirations in medicine were very different than Dr. Bosco's
right.
aspirations in medicine. And that's real life. My female colleagues in medicine have had a different, not uniformly, but have often had a different career experience than I have, and I wanted to demonstrate that in the book.
How about your wife? Is she a doctor?
She's a nurse.
Ah, okay. Did you meet her in the course of being a doctor?
The old-fashioned way.
Of course.
Met her. She's a transplant ICU nurse, and met her in the transplant ICU.
Oh,
So
that's cool. That's great. We're going to take a break here while I drop in my self-serving commercial for my new book as well. But we'll be back in just a moment with Dr. David Weill. Don't go away. And we're back with Dr. David Weill, joining us from Florida to talk about his book, All That Really Matters. It's a novel about a person kind of like him, but not exactly like him, a high profile transplant surgeon who has many stresses in his life. In addition to kind of the day to day stresses of saving lives, he's trying to impress his father. He's got, his love interest who is kind of going off in a different direction, and he's got substance problems, and he's got his own ego. All of these things that he's fighting while he's saving people's lives. There's a one of the themes that you visit often in the book is a theme I've come across in every job I've ever had, which is the line between confidence and arrogance, right? So that's your doctor, your protagonist, Dr. Bosco. He starts out with a lot of confidence. And of course, as he goes along and as he succeeds, has one success after another, like the rest of us, confidence builds. But then he gets to this point where, his confidants at work, they're saying, hey, man, back off a little bit. You don't have to be an asshole to be good. Is that something that you tackled consciously or not?
very consciously, especially in transplant medicine, the folks that are attracted to that, they're not only adrenaline junkies, but they're generally also gratitude junkies.
Gotcha.
And they very much like being told that they save people's life. I'm no exception to
Well, and
that.
Dr. Bosco, he's all that comes up every time. And even Kate says that to him. You like it when people say, thanks for saving my life.
Very much so, and I'm very interested, in what we see when we look in the mirror, and I think that if you are told day after day, year after year that you've saved somebody's life, it does impact the way you look at yourself. Let's be frank, and that was something that I actually struggled with during the course of my career.
Mm.
Not only who I saw in the mirror, but also how I projected myself to my team members and also to the patients. I think that to the patients, I wanted to make sure that they understood that I was the best at what I did. I have you. Don't worry. I got this.
And that's Dr. Bosco says that over and over again when he's talking to patients.
Yeah, and I think that my patients, they loved it. I mean, they really did. They really wanted that. I think most patients don't want a meek, unsure, uncertain transplant doctor. But on the other hand, like everything, you can take it too far. And, my protagonist certainly took it too far at times in the book. And I think that that's the balance that folks that do the kind of work I did have to walk. And some do it well, and some don't do it well.
Well, that's like really anything. I was in broadcasting as an EMT. I worked in the assisted living industry as a communications person. These are all themes that happen in pretty much almost every workplace, right?
I think
Do
that's
you
right.
think that writing this story as a novel is more helpful to people to understand that life as opposed to writing it as a memoir, or not really?
I do actually. I've become increasingly intrigued with, the notion that medicine needs fiction. I think these stories do come to life when they're told in a fictional way, and I think that there's issues within healthcare that aren't going to be solved by all the nonfiction books that have been written about what's wrong with healthcare or PowerPoint presentations, demonstrating how to fix healthcare. I do think there's something to highlighting some of these issues in a fictional form, and I suspect that this one, may have some impact in not fixing healthcare. Certainly, that would be grandiose, but at least highlighting the issues that folks that deliver this kind of care might have, and I'm hopeful about that.
Some of the issues you talk about seem like they're very specific to the transplant part of medicine, which figures. You talk, one of the things that really bugs Joe, your protagonist, and that it gets worse and worse is that kind of the cost of being in this very high profile transplant program is the whole statistical thing. That there's You give one example of a patient who is well past a point of ever getting better, but the hospital and the hospital administration wants to keep her on over a certain amount of time. I guess it's a year, so that they can add that to their statistics as look at all the people we have who have survived for a year or more. Does that actually go on?
Yes. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, it does, and I think that, where I sit right now, I have the privilege, luxury of being able to say it that plainly. But yes, that goes on. Now, whether or not somebody would say that working inside of a transplant hospital currently would be that blunt about it, I'm not sure. But yes, that goes on.
I understand, but I guess for me as a reader, I was wondering what that woman's family is. Is the family of a patient like that holding out hope? And is it false hope? I guess it's false hope, but hope is hope, some people say. So I guess the question would be, who is a doctor or a hospital to say that she doesn't need to be on life support anymore?
Yeah, and that's the tough part of our job. There's hundreds of these ethical and moral dilemmas that we had to address every day, and whether it's selecting patients for the waiting list, which was a selection process. I mean, we called it the selection meeting.
Yeah.
There was that. There was, dealing with people that were underfinanced or under-resourced in other ways that couldn't get a transplant. There was taking care of people afterwards. There was, the issue I brought up of keeping folks alive past the point of really having any chance of meaningful recovery. These are issues that happen inside of transplant programs. Those are not made up.
Yeah, sure. I guess when I look back at the jobs I've had and the places I've worked, every single one of them, I found that in almost every case, the source of kind of systemic problems, drama, uh, is poor communication right along the board, across the board. I mean, even in the news business, even in a newsroom where, you're all supposed to be experts at communicating, sometimes communicating, yelling across a room doesn't always work. Did you find communication, even now as a consultant, is that a major issue that you deal with, or is it just one of many?
It's a major issue. A lot of the teams that I work with now, the reason I'm there is things aren't going well. And when things don't go well in terms of patient outcomes, the team dynamics usually suffer as well. And so I see that all the time. And, the communication is not only not present sometimes, it's dysfunctional, and people don't feel safe expressing their opinion
Mm.
clearly. And I saw that during the course of my career as well. And so I think that it's something that as a consultant I can often help with, because I come in as an impartial party and hear both sides and try to almost mediate a resolution. Because if I can get these teams to work better together, the patients are going to benefit. The people that work there are going to benefit as well, but really the patients are going to benefit.
Do you find your clients are receptive when you come in? I mean, or do they treat you as like, some outside guy who's now going to tell us what we already know kind of thing?
There's a little of both. I mean, to be honest with you, there's a little of both, but ultimately, I I go in there, not on a white horse. I go in there with hat in hand mostly and say, look, I've been there before. I I've done some, great transplant work. I've seen it when it doesn't go well. I've fought with my colleagues, and that happens. That happens in every transplant program.
Yeah.
So what I try to do is go in there and just say, look, I know where you're coming from, but we have to do better, and let me help.
In your book, Dr. Bosco, he hits this wall with this disaster in an operating room when he's kind of right in the middle of a lung transplant. And as I said, I don't want to throw a spoiler out here for the people who haven't read your book yet, but it's a biggie. I mean, it's like, holy crap, did that really happen? Did that really happen to somebody? Or is that something that you concocted one night lying in bed staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m?
The basic premise of it did really happen.
Really?
The basic premise of it, I'm going to underline that.
Okay.
Circumstances around it did not happen. And I'll leave it
Gotcha.
at
But what about the outcome?
the outcome did happen.
Wow. Okay. So, people, that's your teaser. You got to read this book because it builds up to that. And then Dr. Bosco goes into this kind of exile. And then, he kind of comes back as again, I don't want to give it away to you, but it ends up with an uplifting message at the end, I think. And uh, I was really glad to see that actually, because I felt for such a long time I really just disliked the guy. But as I read more, I just got kind of sucked into the life and kind of the details of doing transplants and stuff. It's fascinating to me. It really is. Is there a message in your novel that you wanted to project, or did you just decide I want to write this because I want to write it, or was there kind of an underlying theme and a message that you wanted to get out to your readers?
Well, when I first sat down to write it, I really did want to talk about expectations. It was on my mind. It was an obsession. Expectations was an obsession of mine, I think, for the few years that I was writing this, because I've always been interested in how we deal with either other people's expectations of us or our own expectations. If they're too high, that can lead to a miserable life. If they're too low, that can lead to a
Yeah,
non-productive.
it's always this, right?
And so I got really interested in that. But as time went on and it came to time to title the book, I'm awful at titling my books. I apparently don't have that aptitude. And, my team, the agent and the editor and the publicist wanted to really say, well, what do you think the book is? What's this guy trying to do? And I finally blurted it out that I think he's trying to figure out what really matters in life. And then one of them came up with, how about all that really matters? So I think to your question, that's the theme of the book. This guy is trying to figure out through all of this work and all of these interpersonal relationships, what really matters at the end of the day. And I'm intensely interested in this subject just because I got to see people in my professional life tell me when they wanted to come for a transplant, what really matters to them. Why do they want this? Why do they want to keep on living? And the answers were the education of a lifetime. I got
Yeah.
to hear people that were looking death straight in the face.
Well, I think answering the question or the postulate all that what really matters, I think that's something common to all of us, no matter what you do. And again, that when I finally closed the book and said, okay, I think Dr. Bosco finally got it. Uh, I was also intrigued by what you said a few minutes ago about the fact that you don't outline your book. I've heard authors talk about, well, I just outlined my 52 chapters. Now I'm going to start writing. I could never do that. I just kind of I write linearly. I start writing, and wherever the story goes, it goes. And I love the fact that you do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting also. I went to school in New Orleans with Michael Lewis, the author, and periodically I see him, and he kind of told me that, we think when we're writing the book that we know what the book is about, and we live it for 3 years. And then when my book just came out a week ago, and now people are telling me what the book is about, and he said that's very common. You think it's about one thing, the readers might think it's about another, and they tell you what it's about. And I
Yeah,
find that very interesting, especially during this phase.
yeah, that's cool. So you said you're working on another book now. What's the thumbnail of that?
Basically, it's going to be back to nonfiction, and it's going to be about religious identity. I think it's going to end up being about identity generally, but
Mhm.
the religious identity part of it is something that I've thought a lot about and struggled with during the course of my life. So I'm going to explore all of those issues.
Great. Well, folks, All That Really Matters is available in all the usual places. I found it on Amazon. It's a great book. Dr. David Weil, I really appreciate you joining me. I wish you a lot of luck with the book, and thanks.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.